You noticed a faint pulse in your neck while you sat at the dining table doing absolutely nothing. A gentle but persistent throb in a place that should have felt still. The pressure building behind your eyes before midday. A heavy, dull sensation with no effort to justify it. The warmth spreading across your face and neck without any clear cause. Then came the reading on the monitor, higher than last year, higher than the year before. Fixed stubbornly at a level your physician marked and you have been trying to lower ever since. You reduced salt in your meals. You began walking most mornings before your routine picked up. You even lost a bit of weight. Yet the number stayed put, as if something inside had quietly decided that this level was correct and no effort could convince it otherwise. Here's the unusual part. The part almost no one explains clearly. Your body is not simply failing to lower that number. It is actively protecting it, holding it steady, guarding it, treating that elevated reading as normal, and working constantly to maintain it. It sounds counterintuitive, but it lies at the center of this entire explanation, because a healthy body has multiple systems designed to reduce pressure, and yours is not using them. Something has subtly convinced each of those systems that the higher value is the correct one, the one worth preserving. You have been told your pressure is elevated, but no one has explained why your body defends that level as if survival depends on it. Because beneath the surface, that is exactly what is happening. 6 different systems within you have each pushed the number upward slightly, each for its own purpose, and then settled into maintaining that position. The blood vessels narrowed and remained constricted. The kidneys retained more fluid than necessary. The nervous system kept its alert signals active long after any threat was gone. The arteries became rigid and lost their cushioning ability. Sleep stopped providing proper nightly recovery, and metabolism added its own pressure signal. 6 small upward pushes from 6 separate directions. What binds them together into one stubborn number is the underlying physics you are about to understand. And the final piece, the reason the number refuses to drop regardless of effort, is the most surprising part of all. So let's construct this step by step, one system at a time, while holding back that final explanation. Begin with what the number actually represents, because most people are never clearly told. Blood pressure is force, the pressure of blood pushing against the inner walls of your arteries, and it is measured as 2 values for a reason. The top value, systolic, reflects the force at the moment your heart contracts and sends blood into the arteries. That is the peak. The bottom value, diastolic, represents the pressure that remains when the heart relaxes and fills again between beats. One is a surge. The other is a steady baseline between surges. The artery receiving this force is not just a passive tube. It is living tissue, surrounded by muscle, lined with sensory cells, capable of widening, narrowing, stiffening, relaxing, and sending feedback to the nervous system about its condition. Only 3 factors determine the number you see on the monitor. First, how strongly and how much blood your heart pumps with each beat. Second, how narrow your blood vessels are, because tighter vessels increase pressure as blood flows through. Third, how stiff the vessel walls have become, because rigid walls cannot expand to absorb pressure the way flexible ones can, leaving the force more intense. Increase any one of these factors, and the number rises. Increase 2 or all 3 together, and the number does not just rise. It climbs significantly higher and becomes much harder to reduce. Keep this concept in mind, because everything that follows involves 6 systems applying pressure to those same 3 mechanisms, each contributing to the rise. The first system is located in your kidneys, responsible for regulating how much fluid remains in your circulation. Your kidneys control salt and water balance and operate through a signaling chain that begins with a hormone called renin and ends with instructions to constrict blood vessels and retain sodium. When sodium is retained, water follows, increasing the volume of fluid within your circulatory system. And more fluid within a closed system inevitably leads to higher pressure against the vessel walls. It is the simplest form of physics here, much like how a balloon becomes tighter the more air you add. The kidney's central role in controlling long-term pressure has been studied in great depth. Years of renal research have demonstrated that over extended periods, the way kidneys manage salt and water acts as the primary control for the entire system. This signaling cascade was designed for real emergencies, situations like blood loss or severe dehydration, when pressure drops, and the kidneys must recover it by conserving every possible drop of fluid. However, in many individuals, this system remains overactive continuously, holding on to sodium and water as if the body were always on the verge of collapse. The problem is that the pressure it is trying to fend is already too high, the exact opposite of the situation it was built for. As a result, the system keeps responding to an emergency that either ended long ago or never existed. And with each passing day, the vessels remain slightly more filled than they should be. So the vessels are fuller. But can their walls relax to accommodate this? That depends on a signal produced within the vessels themselves, and that signal is weakening. Each artery is surrounded by a layer of smooth muscle that can either constrict or expand the vessel. The signal that tells it to relax is a gas known as nitric oxide, produced by the extremely thin inner lining of the vessel, a single-cell layer called the endothelium. When blood flows rapidly across this lining, the friction created by that movement activates the process that produces this gas. The gas diffuses into surrounding muscle, instructing it to relax, allowing the vessel to widen. This is why physical activity leaves your vessels relaxed for hours afterward. The flow itself promotes that relaxation. The smoother and faster the blood moves, the more force it exerts along the lining, and the more nitric oxide is produced. A body that stays active maintains flexible vessels through this simple mechanical relationship. The endothelium acts as a regulator of how open or closed your vessels are at any given moment, and its importance is now well established. Yet this thin lining is fragile, one of the most exposed tissues in the body, and over time, factors like elevated blood sugar, smoking, chronic low-level inflammation, and prolonged inactivity gradually damage it until it produces less and less nitric oxide. The signal to relax weakens significantly, and when the muscle stops receiving that instruction, it defaults to maintaining tension, and its natural resting state is tight. As a result, the vessels become consistently narrower, resistance to blood flow increases, and that resistance remains elevated. Instead of expanding to accommodate the extra volume, the vessels constrict against it. So not only is the signal to open diminished, but another system actively pushes in the opposite direction, sending continuous instructions to tighten. This comes from a network of nerves designed to prepare the body for action, the sympathetic nervous system. When activated, it increases heart rate, constricts blood vessels, and signals the kidneys to retain fluid. This response is meant for short, intense situations followed by a clear period of recovery. The body was designed to return to calm just as much as it was designed to react. But modern life rarely provides that clean resolution. Consider ongoing stressors like financial pressure, deadlines, or constant low-level worry that never fully resolves into either danger or safety. These keep the system partially activated for long periods, sometimes continuously, without a proper reset. Even when you appear calm externally, internally your body may still be in a state of readiness, anticipating a threat that never arrives. A hormone called cortisol prolongs this state, sustaining the response long after the initial surge of adrenaline fades, turning it into a persistent, low-level strain that does not go away. This prolonged sympathetic activity is a well-documented contributor to chronic high blood pressure. Researchers like Grassi and his team have directly measured nerve activity and found it elevated in individuals with long-term hypertension. As a result, the command to tighten never truly stops. The pressure your body maintains, even during a quiet, uneventful afternoon, reflects a system still preparing for danger that is not present. So the tightening signal continues hour after hour. But what happens when it briefly eases? At that point, the vessels may no longer respond as they once did. In youth, arteries are highly elastic. When the heart pumps and sends a surge of blood through them, they stretch outward to absorb the force, cushioning the impact. Then they recoil, smoothing that surge into a steady, even flow. This elasticity comes from structural proteins within the vessel walls, particularly collagen, which provides strength and flexibility. And collagen is precisely the substance that gradually stiffens with age through a slow chemical process you may already recognize. It is the same process responsible for the lens of the eye becoming less flexible, leading to farsightedness, and for the discs in the spine losing their softness over time. Free sugar molecules in the bloodstream attach themselves to collagen fibers, linking adjacent strands together step by step, forming crosslinks that transform what was once flexible tissue into a rigid, unyielding structure. The higher blood sugar levels remain over the years, the faster these crosslinks accumulate. Once this happens, the artery loses its ability to stretch. The same heartbeat, unchanged in strength, now strikes against a stiff tube, and instead of being absorbed and smoothed out, the force rebounds as a sharper and higher spike in pressure. Researchers such as Edward Gilicata and Daniel Levy documented how the stiffening progresses with age, showing how the top number blood pressure steadily rises as the cardiovascular system gradually remodels itself. This explains why the systolic value can increase significantly even when the heart's effort remains exactly the same. There is also a second, more subtle effect. In a young, flexible artery, the pressure wave travels forward, reflects off distant branch points, and returns later, arriving during the heart's relaxation phase where it causes no harm. But in a stiff artery, the wave travels much faster, so its reflection returns sooner, arriving while the heart is still contracting and adding directly to the outgoing wave. The two waves combine, raising the peak pressure even further. In this way, arterial stiffness increases the top number twice, first by failing to cushion the pulse, and second by accelerating the returning wave to amplify it. This is also why the gap between the two numbers carries such meaning. A reading like 135 over 85 tells one story, while 160 over 75 tells another. The second shows a wide difference between the top and bottom values, a clear sign of stiffened vessels that no longer soften the pulse. Once the stiffening is established, it becomes difficult to reverse and progresses faster in a body where blood sugar remains elevated over time. At this point, the vessels have largely lost their flexibility. So where was the chance for recovery? Your fifth system was designed to provide it every night, a period when the entire system could reset. For many people, that opportunity has quietly disappeared. During healthy sleep, blood pressure naturally drops by about 10 to 20% as the nervous system calms and the vessels relax. This nightly reduction is essential, giving the heart rest and easing the strain on the arteries before the next day begins. Without it, the system loses its only built-in recovery period. A common but often overlooked condition can remove this benefit entirely. In sleep apnea, the airway repeatedly closes during sleep, cutting off oxygen and briefly waking the body in a subtle internal alarm. Each event activates the stress response and triggers a surge in pressure, and this can happen dozens of times in a single night. Studies by researchers such as Gianfranco Parati have shown how these repeated surges disrupt the normal nighttime drop and leave blood pressure elevated by morning. You may believe you rested, but your body spent the night responding to repeated disturbances, and the pressure you wake with reflects that strain. Signs might include morning headaches, loud snoring, pauses in breathing during sleep, or persistent daytime fatigue despite adequate hours in bed. This pattern is important to discuss with a medical professional because it often points to a system that has gone years without proper nightly recovery. At this stage, 5 systems have each contributed their own upward push. The 6th comes from metabolism and influences several of the others simultaneously. When cells become less responsive to insulin, the hormone responsible for moving sugar from the blood into the cells, the body compensates by producing more of it. This excess insulin itself acts as a pressure signal through multiple pathways. It encourages the kidneys to retain more sodium, increasing fluid volume just like the first system. It stimulates the stress-related nerves, reinforcing the tightening effect seen in the third system. And it reduces the ability of the vessel lining to produce nitric oxide, weakening the relaxation signal described in the second system. One metabolic disturbance reaches into 3 of the pressure controls at the same time. The broad influence of insulin resistance on blood pressure through sodium retention, nerve activation, and vessel function has been thoroughly mapped in research on the metabolic causes of hypertension. There is also a 4th pathway, and it exists within abdominal fat itself. The deep fat surrounding your organs, known as visceral fat, which expands as insulin resistance develops, is not passive storage but active tissue with its own chemistry. One of its roles is producing stress hormones. Within these fat cells lies an enzyme that converts inactive cortisol back into its active form, effectively reactivating it right inside the tissue. The more visceral fat present, the more active this process becomes, quietly generating cortisol within the body. This locally produced cortisol enters the bloodstream and affects pressure in the same way cortisol always does. It makes blood vessels more sensitive to signals that cause tightening, encourages the kidneys to retain sodium, and keeps the stress response nerves active. In this way, abdominal fat behaves like a gland, contributing directly to the pressure it helps create. This forms a fourth pathway stemming from the same metabolic issue, feeding back into the same mechanisms of nerve activity and fluid retention already discussed. This explains why high blood pressure rarely appears in isolation. It often comes alongside an expanding waistline, rising blood sugar levels, fatty changes in the liver, and imbalances in cholesterol. These may seem like separate problems occurring together by chance, but they are actually different expressions of the same underlying metabolic pattern, with blood pressure being one of its most visible signals. At this point, 6 systems are involved, each applying its own upward influence. You now understand what keeps the number elevated. Each system contributes a small increase on its own, but they do not act independently. Together, they amplify the effect and reinforce each other. So, even if one is improved, the others continue to sustain the higher level. This is why reducing salt intake or adding a daily walk may only produce a small change. You adjusted one factor, while several others remained active. However, even a combined effect of these 6 systems does not fully explain the situation, because the body is designed to counter rising pressure. There should be a mechanism detecting the increase and correcting it. This leads to the deeper question: why does the body allow the pressure to remain elevated for years, despite having built-in systems meant to regulate it? There's a sensor designed specifically for this purpose. So why does it stop responding? The answer involves a subtle but important principle. Imagine a thermostat in a large building with multiple rooms. If people in each room gradually increase the temperature without coordination, the overall environment becomes warmer. Normally, the thermostat would detect this and activate cooling to restore balance. But if the sensor itself is exposed to the higher temperature continuously, it may gradually adjust and begin to interpret the warmer state as normal. Once that happens, it no longer triggers cooling because it no longer perceives a problem. The system remains overheated because the sensor has adapted. The body has a similar mechanism for monitoring blood pressure. In the walls of major arteries near the neck and the heart are clusters of nerve endings known as baroreceptors, which act as pressure sensors for the entire circulatory system. They detect changes by sensing stretch in the arterial walls. When pressure increases and stretches the vessel walls, these receptors respond by increasing their signaling rate. That increased firing travels rapidly to the base of your brain, which interprets it instantly and responds by slowing the heart and relaxing the vessels to reduce the pressure. It is a continuous feedback loop, quick and automatic, operating quietly every second whether you are awake or asleep. When it functions properly, a sudden rise in pressure is detected and corrected almost immediately. If you stand up too quickly and feel a brief dizziness that quickly fades, that recovery is the work of the baroreceptors. Now consider what long-term high pressure does to the system. When pressure remains elevated for months or years without relief, those stretch-sensitive receptors gradually adjust, much like the thermostat example. They adapt to the constant higher stretch and begin to accept it as their new normal, the level they are meant to maintain. Their sensitivity shifts upward to match the sustained elevation. This resetting of the baroreceptors under prolonged high pressure was demonstrated by Thomas N. Thrasher, showing how the sensors themselves change their set point to align with the very pressure they were originally designed to correct. Once their baseline rises above your actual pressure, they stop signaling as actively, because from their perspective, the pressure is no longer high. It is appropriate. The steady stream of corrective signals sent to the brain weakens and eventually stops. With no warning from these sensors, the brain sends no corrective response. The pressure, now unchallenged, stabilizes at that higher level. This is what it truly means for the number to be stuck. The very system designed to detect and fix the issue has adapted to it and fallen silent. The alarm has sounded for so long that it has redefined the noise as normal silence. 6 systems push the pressure upward, and the sensor that should have resisted them instead adjusted to match them, effectively supporting the higher level. As a result, your body now protects the harmful pressure as if it were healthy, using real physiological effort every moment to maintain it, even as it slowly affects your arteries, kidneys, brain, and heart. The safeguard that was meant to detect the problem has adapted and now treats it as acceptable. There is, however, some encouraging news within this process. This resetting can be reversed, though it requires time. If the pressure is lowered through consistent measures and maintained at that lower level for weeks or months, the sensors can gradually readjust to a healthier baseline. They begin once again to respond appropriately, sending corrective signals at levels that should never have been considered normal. The challenge is that this recovery is slow and not always complete. It depends on how long the pressure remained elevated and on the condition of the arterial walls where these sensors are located. A baroreceptor embedded in a stiff, less flexible artery has less ability to detect subtle changes than one in a healthy, elastic vessel. This means that arterial stiffness and sensor resetting reinforce each other, making recovery more difficult. The body can relearn a lower pressure, but it does so gradually and sometimes incompletely, especially after prolonged exposure to high levels. The number was higher than the previous year. Physical activity increased, weight decreased, dietary habits improved, yet the reading remained unchanged. 6 systems were maintaining it, each influencing the outcome in its own way. The kidneys retained fluid through signals meant for emergencies that were no longer present. The vessel lining lost its ability to produce relaxing signals as it weakened. The stress response nerve stayed active long after any real threat had passed. Collagen within the artery stiffened over time through sugar-driven chemical changes, turning flexible vessels into rigid ones that amplified each heartbeat. Sleep, which should have provided nightly recovery, was repeatedly disrupted by breathing interruptions, causing repeated surges in pressure. Metabolic imbalance contributed simultaneously through fluid retention, nerve stimulation, and reduced vessel relaxation. And the baroreceptors, the sensors responsible for detecting and correcting high pressure, had reset themselves to accept the elevated level and stop signaling any issue to the brain. The body was maintaining a pressure that was harmful because every system involved had adapted to treat it as normal. The pressure remained high because the system responsible for correcting it had learned to recognize it as acceptable.